Hello my dear friends. Today I am going to deliberate on the topic Approaches to the Study of Gender. Before discussing the main objectives, it's important to define the term gender. Rigwe and Smith-Lowin describes gender as a system of social practices that creates and maintains gender distinctions and organizes relations of inequality on the basis of these distinctions. Thus, within the social system, the social practices operate in gendered ways, thereby creating distinctions and inequalities. Gender is a relational term, which means that man, women, and masculine and feminine are mutually constituted and interdependent. Gender is being continually produced and reproduced, which means that it is much as a process than a fixed state. M.E.S. Wotton views that by understanding gender, we understand more about the social world. This definition itself gives an idea that gender is seen everywhere. So, the challenging task is to explore its meaning in a holistic way. Now, coming to the objectives. The first objective is to study how sex differences creates gender inequalities. The second objective is to understand how gender is constructed in everyday lives. And the third is to explore how gender matters for all of us. However, all these objectives will revolve around three perspectives on gender, which I shall be discussing while elaborating on the objectives. Sex differences creates gender inequalities. This objective will be explained through the lens of sex. So, sex is an ascribed status of an individual which is based on biological differences between different sex categories, which is also called as sexual dimorphism. Sex makes us male and female. On the other hand, gender is an achieved status and makes us masculine and feminine. The first person who makes difference between sex and gender is Robert Stoller, and he gave this term in 1968. The creation of inequalities from natural differences between sex categories is further explained by individualistic perspective. So, individualistic perspective approach believes that the average differences between women and men as groups are greater than the differences within each sex category. Thus, placing individuals in a particular sex category is based on the concept of similarity and difference. This means that sex imposes constraints on gender. These constraints come primarily from different reproductive roles of women and men, that is, biological. Thus, those who believe gender as an attribute of individuals tend to accept that there are some differences between sex categories which are stable across situations. Individualists try to understand gender through the lens of sex, which means sex category sets into motion sex-specific processes of socialization. The socialization process in turn transforms the raw material of biological sex into gender differentiated personalities and behaviors. The process of learning the social practices associated with gender is called gender socialization. So, gender socialization is the process by which the individuals take on gendered qualities and characteristics and acquire a sense of self. Also, through socialization, an individual learns to behave in appropriate situations as expected for each sex category in the society. As there are both specific and broader guidelines for each sex category to behave in different situations in everyday life. Thus, socialization is a two-way process. One which helps to internalize experiences from outside world for the development of self, and the other side of the socialization process are the agents of socialization who pass on the cultural information from one generation to another. The most important agent of socialization is the institution of family. The process of socialization can be elaborated further by social learning, cognitive approaches, identification theory. First, I'll be taking up social learning. So, social learning theory asserts that gender roles are learned through reinforcements, means positive or negative. The children are taught to learn gender appropriate and gender inappropriate behavior. There are certain parameters on the basis of which certain roles are appropriate or inappropriate for particular sex category, and accordingly they are rewarded and punished. Learning these appropriate behaviors mainly takes place by observation and modeling. Children learn by observing their parents and take on their roles in this process. It's important to note that differential treatment of different sex categories by parents and other socializing agents may create gender differences. This way, sex differences may automatically formulate gendered behaviors and gender inequalities. One of the best illustrations of cognitive approach is given by Sandra Bem, stating that during the cognitive development, that is the development of self, people develop schemas. Schema describes an organized pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories of information and relationship among them, or cognitive structures or lenses which helps to assimilate and organize perception. Bem writes, the gendered personality is more than a particular collection of masculine and feminine traits. It is also a way of looking at reality that produces and reproduces those traits during a lifetime of self-construction. Two important terms which would further explain gender schema are gender polarization and androcentrism. Gender polarization is a belief that what is acceptable or appropriate for female is not acceptable or appropriate for males, and vice versa. These notions became part of children's internalized gender schemas, thus leading them to think of other gender as the opposite sex. Thus, gender polarization creates opposites. Androcentrism, on the other hand, refers to the belief that males and masculinity are superior to female or femininity. Thus, gender schemas does not only make children understand male and female as inherently different, but also internalizes that males and masculinity is more desirable and highly valued. Identification theory highlights and tries to explain socialization process, but is different from social learning and cognitive approach. This theory explicitly talks about gender, gender identity and sexuality. Identification theory is best explained by the work of Nancy Chodorow in The Reproduction of Mothering. Chodorow focuses on how men and women develop a personal sense of what it means to be a male or a female. The theory looks at gender identity as formed during early childhood as children develop emotional attachment to the same sex parent or adult. Child is always more attached to mother as all the needs required in the infant stage are fulfilled by her. But as the stage progresses, a child starts developing ego boundaries. So, ego boundary is a sense of separation from me and not me. That is, infants became aware that they are separate beings. Also, that they start categorizing and assigning themselves an identity called gender identity as males and females. According to psychoanalysts, gender identity becomes a powerful force in the personality development. The process of gender identity operates differently for males and females in various ways. the formation of ego boundaries among males and females is seen differently as sons are forced to switch their identification from their mothers to fathers as both belong to the same sex category, which is emotionally painful and difficult. Girls' development unfolds in a different way as they belong to the same sex category of mother. So, girls always see themselves identifying with mothers and never feel any kind of difference. This is what individualists also believe, that there are more commonalities among each sex category than different one. Thus, males and females acquire distinctly different gender identities with different forms of relational potential. Messner tries to relate this that in males, self is solidified through separation from others. This implies that boys and men, more so than girls and women, will be more comfortable with separation and distance. The point is to see how sex differences are responsible for the creation of gender inequalities, that how individuals learn to behave like masculine and feminine in the larger social world through the process of social learning and the development of cognitive structures, or through identification process. This way, we see natural sex difference creates gender differences, and as such, gender identities are constructed. So, dear students, I will be deliberating now the second objective of today's lecture, which is construction of gender in everyday lives. There are varieties of sociological and feminist approaches to study gender in everyday life. Lauber in 1994 argued that gender is an institution that is embedded in all social processes and social organizations of everyday life. She further argued that gender difference is primarily a means to justify sexual stratification. Thus, stratification is the basis for the construction of gender. The construction of gender is not done in isolation, it is done in relation to others. Though there are changes in different societies of the world regarding how these relations operate both in the wider society and within the intimate relationships. Our everyday lives are governed by the way society is organized, that is structure, which includes norms, rules, scripts, and how much power we have to choose agency, means individual will. These structures governs and shapes individuals in different ways. Gender is a multi-level phenomena. It is not simply a characteristic of an individual, but occurs at all the levels of social structures. The gender in everyday life will be explained further through the interactionist perspective. So, what is interactionist perspective? So, this approach stresses more on interaction of individuals rather than individuals only. They place importance to the forces operating outside the individual. In contrast to the individualists, we see human traits and behaviors relatively stable. Interactionists argue that people's reaction and behaviors vary in response to the social context. The social context includes other participants in the setting and features of environment where the interaction takes place. This approach is further explained in three terms. 1. Doing gender. 2. Status characteristic theory. 3. Homophily. The first is doing gender. Doing gender means creating differences between women and men that are not natural, essential or biological. Once the differences have been constructed, they are used to reinforce the essentialness of gender. This is given by Zimmerman in 1987. Doing gender involves a complex of socially guided ways and expressing the same as masculine and feminine characters. Although it is individuals who do gender, but the patterns for doing so are already established. Rather than as a property of individuals, we conceive gender as an emergent feature of social situations, both as an outcome of and a rationale for various social arrangements and as a means of legitimizing one of the most fundamental divisions of society. Doing gender involves behaving and expressing with others in the society, and how are you trying to fit in the society to follow norms, rules, etc. So one of the important concepts while discussing doing gender is gender roles, which means role assigned for a particular sex category in which he or she has membership. Goffman discusses this in the light of gender displays, that if gender be defined as the culturally established correlates of sex, whether in the consequence of biology or learning, then gender display refers to conventionalized portrayals of these correlates. In his view, gender is a socially scripted dramatization of the culture's idealization of feminine and masculine natures, played for an audience that is well schooled in the presentational idiom. We all play as actors in the social world and display our gender identity in everyday life. Now, coming to the status characteristic theory. It is also referred as expectation states. Reisman defines gender is something we do in order to make social life manageable. Sex categorization serves this purpose better than any other categorization system. In the process of interaction, people learn to expect certain kinds of the behaviors and responses from others based on their sex category, which tends to create gender expectations and stereotypes. These expectations serve as cognitive reminders of how we are supposed to behave in a particular situation. A status characteristic is an attribute on which individuals vary that is associated in a society with widely held beliefs according greater esteem and worthiness to some states of attributes, being as males than other being as females. This is Ridgway in 1993. So coming to the concept of homophily, it is the term to describe people's preferences for sameness, a preference that is expressed in their interpersonal relations. The homophilous social ties are reinforced in everyday life in the group to which they identify themselves. That is, males towards male group and females towards female group. Sociologists talk about similarity in terms of beliefs, attitudes and values which are shared by a group of people. These ideas of similarity in social life have tremendous implications on understanding gender. In social settings, there is a degree of similarity by which we identify people. The ascribed characteristics such as sex, race and age are the kinds of proxies most often used to infer similarity or difference with one another. Thus, proxies are shorthand information for us and giving an idea of pattern of interaction. Thus, the meaning of gender is derived from different sources in different situations by us as the members of society. Thus, understanding interaction process helps in exploring meaning attached to each gender and their roles assigned to them. The third important objective which I am going to describe is gender matters for all. Gender matters as it shapes identities and behavioral dispositions of individuals. It matters as it shapes social interaction. It matters as it organizes social institutions. That how individuals by their own abilities shape themselves and categorize them in the particular sex category, and also in the external environment, how their identities are shaped and polished. Third, placing themselves within the macro and micro institutions which are governed by rules and regulations. The whole crux revolves around the social structure of the society in which we as individuals play a vital role. Gender matters as it is the whole of the social life, starting from individual, entering in the process of interaction within the broader institutions of social structure. This will be further explained under the heading of institutional perspective. Within institutional perspective, I will be focusing on institution first. So, institution is defined as organized established patterns, the rules of the game. Institutions are those features of social life that seem so regular, ongoing and permanent that they are often considered as the way things are. Institutional perspective focus on gender as aspect of social structure and culture. It gives an idea of practices and policy of organization. An organization is a social unit established to pursue a particular goal. It has certain boundaries, rules and procedures. They provide scripts which guides you for action. The rules and procedures make each sex category aware of their actions and goals. Accordingly, gender identities are shaped. Thus, institutions are important source of cultural beliefs about gender, and nobody can actually escape from these institutional forces. Also, that institutions are self-perpetuating, that is, taking life of its own. There are different institutions in every society which set different rules for males and females. For example, family, economic system, religion, political system, etc. These are called gendered institutions. Now, I shall be focusing on gendered institutions. Aker in 1992 observes that most of the institutions embody aspects of gender, and those institutions are called gendered, which means gender is present in the processes, practices, images and ideologies and distributions of power in various sectors of social life. Taking as more or less functioning wholes, institutional structures of United States and other societies are organized along the lines of gender. These institutions have been historically developed by men, currently dominated by men, and symbolically interpreted from the standpoint of men in the leading positions both in present as well as historically. Among various institutions, family is the fundamental social institution of our society. It is a primary group in which the members are well knitted. The early socialization begins from family itself, and mother being the primary socializing agent. We are taught to behave, feel, act and react in particular ways. The boys and girls are socialized differently as per the norms of the broader culture. So whatever is taught becomes the way things are, seems always natural and does not look as constructed reality. Thus, family is the first gendered institution all of us encounter, though there are other gendered institutions which also play an important role in shaping gender ideologies. In this way, we understand gender institutions as major source of gendered power and role distribution which results in gender inequalities. So in today's lecture, I have discussed how gender is different from sex and how the difference which is based on biology can create inequalities. This has been explained by individualistic perspective through the medium of social learning, cognitive approach and status characteristic theory. Differentiating sex, which is an ascribed status, with the gender, which is an achieved status, and how its construction takes place in everyday lives. This was explained with the help of interactionist perspective by linking it with doing gender, status characteristic theory and homophily. Placing gender within social structure has been explained through institutional perspective by giving an example of gendered institutions. Gender is embedded in the individuals, interactions and institutional dimensions of our society. It is continually constructed in everyday lives and matters for all of us as it involves the whole of the social structure. Understanding gender equally requires looking closely into social structure of the society from which its origin has taken place. Giddens, while analyzing gender, rightly says that social structure and action goes hand in hand. This means social structure not only acts on the people, but people act on social structures. Giddens is concerned that why actors choose their acts. He believes that certain acts are taken for granted and actors doesn't articulate or even consider why they act. This takes place mainly because of the cultural components of social structure, which has some expectation states that each of us meet in every social encounter. So studying different approaches of gender therefore has brought in attention to explore main bases of the creation of gender inequalities in the form of sex differences, doing gender, gender displays, gender roles, expectation states, etc. Dear students, with this we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have understood it well. We shall meet again with a new topic. Till then, goodbye.